Welcome, everybody. We're having another installation of the Open Book Tour. Today our guest is Mare Eckstein Gower, and she is a consummate book artist. We encountered her work for the first time, or I did personally, at a Bainbridge Arts and Crafts exhibit. And the book that was on exhibition and is now in the collection was Journey to the Place of Truth. Is that,
yes, that's right.
Okay, Journey to the Place of Truth. And it examined Egyptian burial practices and beliefs, exquisitely done with the containers that would ordinarily have contained the viscera of the deceased, each one now carrying some description of the burial practice and those concepts. Mare's work is absolutely distinctive. You could stand in a room and across the room say, there is one of her pieces. They are absolutely identifiable as hers and no one else's, and yet each one is different from the other in an extraordinary way. She takes on really big themes like time from the Big Bang to the present, and compared with the origin myths of many different countries and peoples. And what is to me her most recent book, Girl Interpreted, deals with the contrary notions that that women are, the eternal woman is probably one of the oldest themes in all of our culture, and yet women are typically contained, their activities limited, so that they are both the most wonderful thing and the thing that must be guarded against. It's really interesting. Here to lead us through all these wonderful thoughts and images is Mare Eckstein Gower.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. All right. So, thank you so much for being here. This is lovely. It's fun to be able to talk about these things in person and to talk about all of my different inspirations and the things that go behind the books. I'm going to start with the Vessels from the Place of Truth. And when I was creating this, I was trying to replicate a bit of the feeling of an Egyptian burial. And so I have my my little mummy wrap around the book where I did the linen. And I was fascinated in my research, and every book that I do has a huge amount of research, to discover that across from the Valley of the Kings there is a place where they call the Place of Truth. And this is where all of the artisans who worked on the pharaoh's tombs had their own burial places. And they would trade with one another, like artists will do, obviously, throughout history. So if you were somebody who was a painter on the walls, you might trade with somebody who was a sculptor for work on your own tomb. And so a lot of the work on these tombs is just exquisite. It's very different than what you see in the royal tombs, because these are people who are a little bit more ordinary than somebody who is considered a god. But they have the skill set that the tombs that they have assembled are really quite beautiful. And so what I was looking at was making kind of an imaginary journey of what one of the scribes would consider, how they would interpret the voyage through the netherworld. And I don't know how much people know about Egyptian history. I was really inspired by an exhibition that I went to where they had rooms that were filled with all of the different instructions from the Book of the Dead, visually painted across all of the walls, that went through the 12 hours of what the soul's journey would be to go. And they were, quite an adventure where you were facing monsters and different kinds of gods and trials, and till you got to the point where your soul was being weighed, that people were seeing, were you worthy to go to their version of the good place. And so it was very interesting, because it's almost like I looked at this and it's like, oh, they're giving them cliff notes. Here you are. If you haven't memorized all of the steps that you're supposed to take, here they are on the wall. At this hour, this is what you're supposed to do. At this hour, this is what you're supposed to do, and this is how you will face these horrible trials, and so this is what I was essentially working on with this book, and I really love the accordion book structure, and I felt like it really worked very well with this, because you could go through sort of like what they would in the walls, with what the different processes were, and there are the sections where they enter the pyramid, and I have quotes from the Book of the Dead that I copied from hieroglyphs. It shows what an arduous journey the soul had, actually, going through the pyramids. And
is that printed or
hand lettered? Oh, the book itself.
Yeah.
When I do an edition, I do they're a high quality inkjet printing. I have a designer printer, and you will see the difference later on. I have Cynthia owns some of my one of a kinds, and you can see there's a huge difference in what the originals look like, but you do get the vibrancy. And this is the one piece that has information about it, and also where I've put kind of your own cliff notes for what's going on with each of the different aspects of the and it translates the hieroglyphics. And in tombs, when they were doing the embalming process, strangely enough, the Egyptians thought the brain was just sort of superfluous and they'd throw it away. But they recognized the heart as being the most important part of the body. If you lost a person's heart, there's no way they could go to their version of heaven through the netherworld. That was the most important thing to keep, and that was kept in the body, sort of wrapped up. But all of the viscera, each thing had its own goddess that was in charge of it. It had all different aspects of what it took care of, and they were put in what is called a canopic jar. And so each of these is sort of a replica, and it had a guardian spirit. So this is the guardian spirit for your stomach. So these are replicas of each of.
So there were jars for different body parts?
Yes, you had your liver would be put in one, your lungs would be put in one, your stomach would be put in one. So, and they had the 4 different So here's for your lungs. And you had your guardian spirit. So it was connected to how they saw the process of what that particular organ did. And some things they seemed to be kind of right on, and some things were not. But yes, and here's your intestines, and you know how they intestines. It's interesting because she was a scorpion goddess, so. For your liver. Let's see, I'm going to move on to soldier's heart. And this is a book where I'm really talking about PTSD because my father had been in the Pacific Theater in World War II. He actually flew 75 missions. Mm-hmm. They had him sometimes going out 3 times a day. Mm-hmm. And my mother talked about when he came home, he had really horrible nightmares. But this was at a period where the men who went through that never really talked about their experiences. There was a part of them, I think, that just sort of shut down. And I remember talking to my grandmother a little bit about this. And she was talking about her father, who came home from the Civil War. And she said he had soldier's heart. And I looked at her and I said, Grandma, what does that mean? And she said, oh, now, we would call it shell shock, because that was the word that she had. And I was really struck with, this is interesting. All through the ages, we have acknowledged that soldiers come back with wounds that are not physical. And yet, up until really the Vietnam War, it was not acknowledged as something that was a true psychological disorder, and that these people were treated with anything other than it was a shameful thing to admit that you had this. And I started doing research, and I discovered that there are references to soldiers coming back way, I mean, in the Iliad, you have the scene where Ajax goes berserk after Achilles is killed. And he goes to the countryside, he kills every sheep he can find. You have, from Greece, you have Leonidas had to take one of his soldiers out of the battle, and these are the Spartans that are supposed to be just totally, shut off from fear, that one of his men went spontaneously blind because the soldier next to him was shot through the eye. Mm-hmm. And this is in historical record. So that the whole thing of PTSD has been with us throughout history, and yet we have not had, I guess you'd call the sympathy or the understanding for the people who come back with this type of
damage.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. I was trying to, yes, thank you for being right out there with it. I was trying to be politic and think of a word that was less, but yes, the damage that it has done for people. And at that time, I was also looking at the biotapestry, and I was thought, this is the perfect structure, because I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it was done after the Battle of Hastings, and it chronicles the entire lead up to it. It was an interesting piece of propaganda, actually, for the Normans to be able to supposedly prove that they had a right to invade England and to take over the country. there are scholars who now say that there's bits of it, if you really look closely, because it was probably embroidered by nuns from Britain, so they would be Saxon nuns, who were putting in little hints that perhaps he didn't have as much a right to invade the country as he did. But so there are scholars who will look at this and go, yes, well, look at right here. They're showing that perhaps his claim to the throne was not as wonderful as he was thinking it was. So the structure of the biotapestry is that they have kind of your 3 tiers, and you have your center tier that is the main action, but they had areas that were commentary above and below that were a smaller strip. And so I was mirroring this structure, but I was showing how through history the ideas of PTSD, and I've used the different names that people have used for it, and they're interesting euphemisms, some of them. Combat fatigue, as if you're just sort of tired and not really stress response syndrome. So I've gone pretty much, and I've looked at a lot of the different archaeological monuments and how people have glorified war. And I've put those that are, you have here, I think we have Hannibal crossing the Alps. And all of these, I looked at different sources, like for Hannibal, different coins from Carthage. I looked at the Book of Kells. A lot of, here we have, oh, this is really interesting, the different Viking gold-plated things, and it was interesting to me because you could see how much they used dogs in their battles. That they would have some different, like there's a very famous cauldron where they have the figures, and they showed dogs that have been killed in battle along with their soldiers, as well as the different dogs that are accompanying their soldiers. And I thought that was very, very interesting, something that you just don't see a lot of. And I suppose that's a real good reason why they managed to get to the South Pole before anybody else did. The British just kept using horses who couldn't make it, and then the I think it was the Danish. Okay, my history is not so great right here, but anyway, the Scandinavian team used dog sleds, so they were able to make it because they're used to using dogs. And I'm a real history buff, obviously, in what I'm doing. So this chronicles different ways that that PTSD had been presented. And
It's interesting that the Navajo had it too, but they had a cleansing ceremony for men who were returning from war.
oh, really?
Culture, yeah.
So they really acknowledged it and understood it, whereas we just would just throw it under, sort of, under the table. Wow. Okay.
Well, we were founded by people that believed in suppression of feelings.
Yes, yes. Yeah, these are really, with this in particular, it really is nice if you can
All the way.
extend it, because that's what the biotapestry is it's this huge piece. Yeah, they're very long. They're difficult to display unless you have a lot of space sometimes, or they're yeah.
Where Where is the biotapestry?
It's in France now.
Normandy. Don't remember hearing that name before.
Okay.
It's in Normandy, it's in a town called
Right.
Bayeux.
Yeah, because I've heard of it, but not the name.
Yeah.
How many pieces in the Bayeux tapestry? How many panels? It's an endless number.
It's quite long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought there was something like 100.
Yeah.
What a
yeah.
job.
Are they all
How long
sewn
did it
together?
take them? I mean, you know. it's just
The
amazing.
skull, yeah, there's I'm not sure that they've debated about how long it was in England, and now they do look at the embroidery and they have traced it to a style in a particular nunnery in England. So they are pretty sure that it was done by those nuns, but as far as how long it took them to do, I don't remember anything in my reading saying.
Yeah.
But they were building cathedrals that took generations. In
Yes.
those days, too. People lived a short time, but the projects lived longer.
Yes. All right, and this particular book is called Circle or Zero, and I'm going to just really do a very quick version on this because I could probably be talking about this for several hours. And this is a book that I was fascinated with the idea of circles and zeros. Because if you think about it, they're the same shape, and yet they mean entirely different things. And you look at different cultures, and there are cultures like the ancient Greeks who could embrace and understand the circle, because a circle is a geometric form. It is the same properties no matter what its size. You can measure it, it's a very intellectual, very understandable structure that has rules. Zero, on the other hand, is a really, really kind of mushy kind of a thing because it's everything and nothing. It's a placeholder that can mean nothing. It's a placeholder that can mean 1,000,000, depending on how many you have. It's infinity. And this was a concept, the whole concept of infinity was something that the Greeks just could not get their hands around. Whereas if you look at the Hindus' whole religion is based on the whole idea of infinity, of the circle of the things going around and around and around. And I found this whole idea of the contrast between these two shapes that look the same, that mean such a different thing. And what I did is, and this was about 9 months of research for this book. It was really a crazy project because I had to get my little brain around physics, and I would go to my husband. It was really funny, and I'm going, really? Everything is made out of stars? And he goes, yeah. And then, of course, later on, when I was doing, I had him proofreading because most of my books have to have sort of my own version of here's what I'm doing, so you understand what the visual thing is as well as the verbal. So he's proofreading this, and I have my timeline, and he said, well, what are the Dark Ages? And I said, well, they're the Dark Ages. And he said, well, what does that mean? What's that a metaphor for? I said, well, they're the Dark Ages. And he said, well, no, this can't be right. It has. This is what they call. We were having almost an argument over it. This is what they call it. And he said, but what do Dark Ages mean? And finally I said, there was no light. He goes, oh, okay. all right. So then that's fine. Yes, all right. I don't need to have you put a different thing for that. But anyway, what I did is I'm going from the Big Bang through to essentially Darwin's finches.
That's
What-
a very
what is-
ambitious project.
Yeah, it was a very ambitious project. And to make it even harder on myself, because my theme is circle or zero, I was telling this story entirely with circle shapes. And every time I do a project, I give myself kind of these little challenges. And usually they're pretty invisible to the person who's looking at it. But my challenge was I did not want to repeat any composition. I wanted to be telling the story of what is actually physically happening through shapes within circles. And so this was my challenge for what I was doing with the entire progress. And then on top of that, I wanted to be comparing it, because this is really more physics and the scientific view of what creation is. I was working with different world myths of how they saw creation. And I was making these little altarpieces that go within it. And each of those would be a mandala, and they would have, we were going with a circle, and they had to all be a different composition within the mandala. I was not going to be repeating, a same architectonic kind of a composition or what have you. And they had to be in some way telling the creation myth. Now, this was also a challenge because, there's so many different, if you're dealing with Egypt, they have, this is a civilization that existed for thousands of years, so that and you have the Upper Nile, the Lower Nile, you have areas which would have different creation myths. If you're looking at Africa, well, what part of Africa are you going to talk about? So I did get to do a lot of editing, and I had to make choices, and I would, usually have sometimes they were very logical choices, sometimes they were choices of, this is what I want to draw. So, but anyway, as you can see, this is something that could be talked about for hours and hours, but this is just a little taste. In between, this one is the bone garden. This was a year and a half ago. I had to have knee replacement surgery, and I had a really horrible recovery period. And so one of the things that I was doing is I decided to do a book that was talking about the healing process, and that we can have periods where we feel like we're totally broken, and there's a despair to that, but that in the end that things do mend. They may not be exactly the same, but they do mend, and we move on. My process for a lot of books is very, very crazy, and I really don't recommend it to anybody. I kind of do things stream of consciousness, and usually the images come first. And I will go from panel to panel, and I have no idea what my next panel will be. And this is why I say I don't recommend this to people. And I have a period, my husband can verify this, where I just go, oh my gosh, the words are never going to come. I have no idea, because I don't know what the words are going to be, and is it going to happen? And it always does. It's sometimes at 3 a.m. in the morning, I'll jump up and start scribbling, but they always do come. But I never know really. I will know the theme, and usually I'm working with a color palette, but they are image to image, so I'm, in a sense, experiencing the book as I'm making it the same way I am having my audience experience the book, that I'm discovering what goes on at the same time. And this is this is probably a very good experience of that, because it was pretty much a journey through just, am I ever gonna be walking without?
So the form of the book reflects your thinking process and your creative process.
Very much so, very much so. I like the idea of having a kinetic quality. That's what's appealing. The reason why I'm not just painting is I think I'm thinking in 3D, but not sculpturally.
The people that experience your art experience it as much the way you did as you can make it happen by using a book form instead of...
Yes, exactly. This was done for an exhibit honoring the UN Year of Awareness for Soil. And what I was doing was I was talking about burrowers who live within the soil. And what I wanted to have my book do is reflect that when you open it.
That is the cool thing about artist books.
So these are all of, I don't know how, if you can see, but this is showing how, so I wanted to have, because that's the thing that I think is so wonderful about book arts, is that kinetic quality of being able to have the burrowing animals burrow.
What is that one called?
This one is called Dirt. The burrowers.
It does have a gorgeous, just show the camera.
Oh, yeah, oh, yes. And I put it within like a cabinet of curiosities. So this is a good one for you to see, because these are all originals. And you can see that the ink on the back has a ghosting. So there's a very different.
Yeah.
Question?
Yes.
You use a pen, ink, watercolor?
Mostly inks. Yeah, like
Mostly inks?
mostly inks.
Pen?
Pen.
Do
Yeah.
you use the Rapidograph or a regular nib?
I'm using the Faber-Castell.
Nib.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Nib.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I get a consistent line that way.
Right.
Versus if I'm doing a crow quill, I'm having a more gradated line, which
A different effect.
Okay.
I'm keeping my, and
Oh, the Faber-Castell, but that is a...
It is. It's India ink.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
India ink. Girl interpreted. And this is, I worked with this as an altarpiece structure. Oh, there goes the book. And when I was doing, some of my research, I was struck by looking at portraits, especially Renaissance portraits of women, and it was interesting to me to see the number of times if you really, really looked at the face, they look so young. Some of these, I mean, they're really, you can see that they're just a girl, really. They're not even into their full womanhood, and yet, especially, during more the French period, you would see these little girls that are sort of dressed up like dolls with their powdered wigs and all of the finery, and a lot of times there's almost a frightened look or in their face of how am I going to navigate the world, and I thought it was very moving, because clearly, throughout history, if you look at the way women are treated, if you're in the upper classes, you're the object, really, that is cementing dynasties together, that it's a huge negotiation process of, okay, we want to be allied with this family, so we'll marry these, children frequently are even before they can walk, they've been betrothed to somebody, so that these families can have these alliances. And it just really struck me as a contrast to when you look at the ancient goddess images of how in Neolithic times and in some of the very early religious processes, that the female was regarded as something very, very powerful. When I was doing my research for Circular Zero, one of the most moving things that I found was a prehistoric site in Romania where they found this village, and underneath the houses they found these bowls with, usually it would be these 12 goddess figures. And they were very, very primitive, but they found them under a lot of different houses. And it was like, what is this? And the archaeologists still don't really even know, because it wasn't like it was one worship place. It was under these houses, and some of them had little chairs to sit on. Most of them had no arms, which I thought was very, very interesting. And they were these little figures in a bowl. So tiny goddesses in a bowl. And it was just interesting to me that I thought of the contrast between how women have, and even today, you have the families and I know that in Indian culture it's very normal that you sometimes don't meet who your spouse is going to be until right before the wedding. And that whole concept of how women are both revered and looked at as a commodity, and it was a very interesting contrast to me. This also was a period when I was working with the altar structure, because I had the piece I referred to at the University of Washington was a commissioned piece, and I was working on the theme of Cupid and Psyche, and I knew I wanted to make the piece into an altar piece, so I was looking at different ways of working with the altar form, and how I could incorporate a book into that, and just liking that whole idea of something precious being contained within this. So for this book, I worked with a very different structure in that, and this is all original art as well. So you can, as well as the burrowers, you can see kind of the difference of what the original is like. So it's read across. So it's talking about, how in different cultures, the young women, and as in the Chinese culture, where they would bind their feet, so it's like they're regarded as something very beautiful, but something contained. I saw a really interesting play in Ashland several years ago that was on a South American nun who had written poetry and plays, and because there was a rather erotic aspect to them, they were banned by the church and burned, and she had a very a very difficult time, and some of the reason that she was a nun was her family sort of pushed her off because she was a little bit too uppity for them. And so that was sort of like, okay, the chance with, it's like a game of cards. What are you going, where are you going to be? Are you going to be out in the world? Are you going to be in a nunnery? And then moving on to this is what those little goddesses looked like. They have these interesting, they're all clay figures, but they would have spiral designs in the clay.
What period was identified for those little figures?
They were definitely prehistoric.
Or prehistoric?
Prehistoric.
Yeah, got it.
So
before the Romans.
Oh, definitely.
Way before.
Way
Yeah.
before the Romans. And of course, this is the Minoan. Well, actually, no, here's our Minoan. This is the Etruscan, yeah. And there's the, usually they associate, well, she's the mistress of animals. She's been identified with several later figures, but she's pretty common. And then I end up in the end with a piece that is the heart of the girl. Yes. I'm just finishing up a piece where last summer we were really fortunate to do a cruise in the Mediterranean, and my absolute favorite thing about the cruise was visiting Ostia Antica. And I found that a very transformative experience, and to visit this city that had been buried for so many years, and then it didn't feel dead to me. It wasn't exactly like there were ghosts, but it felt like there was still a life to this place, that I could feel it, just sort of like there's something that had embedded in the stones. And I'm working on a piece, and I'm doing a structure similar to this piece, which is a double accordion. This is a Mondrian. Which is a double accordion. And so I'm working on the idea of lost cities and found cities, and what remains. How do we judge a civilization? And so much of, really, if you're looking at archaeology, a lot of what we're judging a civilization by is what their buildings are like, what their architecture, and of course also what they find in the trash heaps. But so what I was dealing with am dealing with is sort of an imaginary journey, and the idea of lost cities and finding them, and how does that translate to what we've found in these civilizations. And so in the front is sort of is a bit of a fantasy journey, and in the back I have I have one for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and for that, of course, I had to look at different sources of what do they really think the Hanging Gardens looked like. What were they meaning by that, and archaeological studies. And then there's one for Atlantis, and there's one Greek island that they think may have been Atlantis, and I've done quotes you know, that are behind, as well as my poem in the front. So that's one that I'm working on right now. And I'm kind of finishing that one up, and then I want to do my next project. I'm going to be working on comparing architecture to homelessness, because that's an issue that I find very disturbing. And looking at different architectural styles, and I'm thinking I may do something that's based on this double accordion. The thing I like about this is that you have the hidden things that you have to kind of look through the little peepholes to see what your hidden story is. So you have the story in front and the story in back. I like that double layer of things.
It's interesting to remember, though, when we're looking at architectural representations or remnants, those were the ones that lasted, which were produced by the rich people, by the...
Not
Unless you're in the
always,
middens.
yeah.
Because most of the people, common people stuff was made out of stuff that deteriorated, wood and reed, whereas
Although
kid stuff
they
was made
have
of stone.
they have found, you know, like I know in England, some of the things where they find the posts
Yeah.
of where things were. But yeah, it is the thing that's interesting about the Roman things is that you did have the different classes, and that they built everything with stone. You know, that and the stonework that they did was just, to me, it was amazing that you just see a wall and they'll have, you know, it's like they loved mosaic. And I grew up in Southern California when I was little, and they, in the 50s and 60s, they had a real strong, they had several artists who were very, very great mosaic artists. So they would do work on the side of a bank. I think it was sort of a leftover from some of the WPA stuff. But you could see a lot of structures that just had these beautiful mosaics. And, you know, just on the side of a bank. And the place I went to school, I went to Scripps College, there were a lot of mosaics there, because some of those artists that would be commissioned to do the thing, one of them had been a professor. It was before my time, but you know, he'd been a professor at Scripps. And so I grew up being around a lot of mosaic work, and so it intrigued me to see sort of the ancient mosaics and how prevalent they were, just at the bottom of you know, one of their bathhouses. These amazing black and white mosaics of you've been there, right?
I've seen some of those things. Yeah.
They're just phenomenal. It just is amazing what they had. So that was the influence for the thing that I'm working on right now. And then I'm going to be moving on to the homeless thing. With the architecture, I think it's kind of interesting, because you look at how many glass skyscrapers we have. What are we going to be leaving behind?
Plastic.
It's going to be interesting, but I guess we're not. I'm not going to be here to see it. So.
Okay,
Thank you.
Mare, thank you so much. This has been